in just a second. Firing up Zoom. Is everybody ready for summer?
Oh, yeah.
Who's got a holiday vacation coming up? Anybody? Out of the country, out of town? One, maybe two, maybe three. Sweet. Bride's gonna be busy, so if you're around, come and see us.
We're live.
We're live. All right. I get duties that I don't normally have this evening. So it is my pleasure to do the introductions tonight. Welcome. If this is your first time, you are in the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, LGBTQ bookstore. I am Donnie. I'm one of the co-founders with my partner, Greg, up on stage. And we started on the Lower East Side, 10-ish, 11 years in November. So we've been here at the center since they renovated and they gave us a home. So we're here. So thanks for coming tonight. We have all kinds of events, book readings, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, art exhibitions. Slava Mogutin's exhibition is currently up on the wall right now that you see. We do movie screenings, community talks, you name it, performance as well. So we do have a suggested donation for our events of $10. Pay what you can, pay what you will. But if you haven't already gotten the book, that's a great way to support us and Neil. So if you could just pass this around, pass it on to the next neighbor. If you don't have tonight, that's okay. And as that's happening, we would like to, before I introduce, read a brief land acknowledgement. The Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We are actively seeking to partner with and provide material support to a local queer Indigenous organization. We hope to make an announcement about a partnership in the near future, but in the meantime, we encourage you to join us, the Bureau, in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. Please visit mannahattafund.org. And without further ado, I will do some introductions. My partner, Greg Newton, co-founder of the Bureau, in conversation with Neil Thies, a professor of pathology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Through his scientific research, he has been a pioneer of adult stem cell plasticity and the anatomy of the human interstitium. He is also a longtime student of Zen Buddhism. Neil studies in complexity theory. His studies have led to interdisciplinary collaborations in fields such as integrative medicine, consciousness studies, and the science-religion dialogue. Please, warm welcome, Panda.
Donnie, thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody.
I'm happy to be here. Side note.
I'm happy to have you. Is the sound okay? Is this, yeah, okay, great, thank you. A little louder, that's okay, a little louder.
So Neil, you were going to read a little something from your book
Why, yes, I
that dropped
was.
yesterday.
This is my first reading. If you want the audio book, you should go take a look at pictures of the guy reading it. It would look like the way he sounds and actually looks. Okay. It's awesome. That's what pink sticky is.
Yeah.
Chapter 1. The Science of Being. Nothing in the universe is more complex than life. Microscopic life abounds both in the scalding, pressurized, sunless depths of ocean trenches and upon the highest frozen Himalayan peaks. In between, throughout skies, in oceans, and across lands, life is endlessly on the move. And surely, in the billions of years in which organisms will continue to thrive on the planet, there will be vastly more life forms with variety beyond anything we might imagine. The complexity of all this rich abundance has long resisted explanation. The origins of life remain deeply mysterious. What biological wonders might emerge next are beyond our knowing. If we were even to begin to fathom it all, a theory of complexity was necessary. Complexity theory is the study of how complex systems manifest in the world. The use of the word complexity here does not mean merely complicated, however. Complexity in this context refers to a class of patterns of interactions, open-ended, evolving, unpredictable, yet adaptive and self-sustaining. It is this complexity that we will explore, how life self-organizes from the substance of our universe, from interactions within the quantum foam to the formation of atoms and molecules, cells, human beings, social structures, ecosystems, and beyond. A distinguishing feature of life's complexity is that in every single instance, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Even if one knows the characteristics and behaviors of all the individual elements of a living system, a cell, a body, an ecosystem, one cannot predict the extraordinary properties that emerge from their interactions. In complexity theory, these surprising outcomes are called emergent properties, or just plain emergence. This unpredictability is both a core subject of complexity theory and a key feature of what it has to offer our understanding of the world. Neither we nor our universe is machine-like. A machine doesn't have the option to change its behavior if its environment changes or becomes overwhelming. Complex systems, including human bodies and human societies, can change their behaviors in the face of the unpredictable. That creativity is the essence of complexity. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So much is packed into that simple expression. Colloquially, the phrase evokes community, teamwork, elevated purpose, the ways in which people with their own differing talents and abilities, when working together, can create synergies beyond the scope of what any of the individuals alone might have been capable of producing on their own. A winning team, a social movement, a perfect dinner party. But complexity extends far beyond human beings and their social behavior. Examples of complex systems are found not only in sociology and biology, but also in chemistry and physics. The universe is a shimmering web of complexity that continually births and nurtures life, tempting us to believe that life might even be its central purpose and most fundamental expression. Complexity bridges the seemingly unbridgeable gap between the universe at its most infinitesimal, described by quantum mechanics, and at its most vast, described by the theory of relativity. As successful as those two most successful of all scientific theories have been, they are unable on their own to illuminate how we go from the most basic patterns of existence, space, time, matter, energy, to the complex behaviors of living organisms and their social structures, ecosystems, cultures, civilizations. It is complexity theory that shows how the entities arising from fundamental physics actively weave themselves into ever larger structures, step by step, until they become the fabric of our everyday lives and of the dynamic natural living systems that surround us. While the aims of complexity science are grandly ambitious, when studied with careful intention, its lessons can also be deeply personal. It can solve some of the most crucial riddles of our sense of being. In the womb and for a relatively short time afterward, we are in a seamless world in which we experience no divisions. There is no self and no other. There is no baby and no mother. Gradually, inevitably, in early infancy, we move from the state of intimate wholeness into another state, one of separation. We become bounded by our skin. Everything inside it, an I. Everything outside it, the world. Parts, not wholes. Occasionally, if we are fortunate, we find ourselves in a situation with other people in which we achieve that feeling of complete unity, of something bigger than ourselves. In the absence of that experience, many of us will spend our days struggling to understand how I and the world relate. If we're at all able to recall that sense of seamless unity, we may look over our shoulder and wonder, how can I get back to that? And if we're not able to recall it, we may instead just be left with the uneasy sense that something is missing, even though we're unsure what that something is. Complexity theory not only provides us with scientific understanding, but as we travel down its paths, the implications of the theory can also enlighten us, providing insight into everything from the permeable boundaries of our bodies to the nature of consciousness. Complexity theory can foster an invaluable flexibility of perspectives and awaken us to our true deep intimacy with the larger whole, so that we might return to what we once had, our birthright of being one with all. That's all. No high stakes there. So one of the things so obviously I haven't told you really much about complexity at all. And what I really wanted to talk about is in the context of our bookstore and our community is how does that connect? How does this kind of perspective in science arise from my own experiences? But we weren't sure, I wasn't sure whether I should do a little song and dance for 5 or 8 minutes about the actual science of the complexity, and yeah.
You're not gonna get it from me.
And if you wanted me to elaborate on stuff, we can in Q&A, you can ask me about that. You know, everything is sort of fair game. So how do we connect up the quantum level all the way up to this stuff? How does complexity do that? So I talked about complexity as talking about systems of individuals that interact with each other to create this larger whole. And, you know, you can take apart a clock or a machine and you get parts and you assemble them and they become the whole, the clock or the machine. And if you're a really good engineer, you can even look at them and intuit what they're going to build. This will be a clock, that will be a car. And it's always going to be precisely the same. With complex systems, we're talking about interactions that are not, as I said, machine-like. And what makes them not machine-like is that they fulfill 4 basic criteria. So the first one are rules, and that's what chapter 2 is. What are the rules that make a complex system an actual complex system and allow the magic of emergence to happen? The first is that you have to have enough. So an example that I use in the book, and I often use in my talks, is ant colonies, because everyone's sort of familiar with ants. So you have 3 ants, that's not enough to make a colony. 25 ants is, and I know that because you can buy, and I did this because, well, if I'm going to talk about ants, right? You can buy an ant farm from the back of a comic book. Now you just go online. It's disappointing. And they will dig tunnels, they'll make food lines, and there'll be a little cemetery in the corner. When an ant dies, they'll carry it there. And so 25 ants are enough to give you the basic organizational structure of an ant colony. But as you watch them die off, and I couldn't do this more than a few times, but I did it a few times, then the cemetery gets abandoned, and then the food lines aren't forming, and then the tunnels aren't being dug. And when you get to like 2, 3, or 4 ants, they're just ants doing their own thing, and there's no organization. So you need a certain number, and you can actually take ant colonies and string, I did not do this, but you can string them together. The more ants, the more complexity, the more diversity of interactions. So a colony of 100 ants is not the same as 1,000 ants, isn't the same as 10,000 ants. And one of the things about complex systems is these rules and the math that describes them are exactly the same regardless of what we're talking about. So a village, a city, a village is not a city is not a megalopolis. What goes for ants goes for humans, goes for the cells in our bodies, etc. So numbers matter, that's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is that they have to interact with a predominance of what are called negative feedback loops as opposed to positive feedback loops. That doesn't mean negative is bad, positive is good. It's actually the other way around. So a negative feedback loop is like an air conditioner. Room gets too warm, air conditioner turns on, room cools down, air conditioner turns off. And so you have this oscillation in a healthy range, what's called a homeostatic range. And this sort of oscillation, all living things oscillate. Nothing remains still. If it's still, it's a dead thing. So the oscillation is what's important. You can have positive feedback loops, which would be like if the heat, if a room is hot, a heater turns on and the room gets hotter and the heater turns out. Obviously, you don't want those to predominate, but you know in biological systems that itself is actually useful when you have a fever. That's a positive feedback loop. But there's always negative feedback loops which can bring it back. If you have a predominance of positive feedback loops, you can get emergent self-organization, but that's like a hurricane, tornadoes, cancer. We're talking about cells. So you have to have a predominance of negative feedback loops to keep things in this homeostatic oscillation. The third rule is everything is bottom up. There's no top down hierarchy to the system. And so the ants interacting with each other, there's no ant in the colony that's organizing where the food line's going to go, where the cemetery is. It's just happening from local interactions with ants by how they lay down pheromone signals, sense signals that they detect from each other, and what they bump into when they bump into something like sugar or another ant. And out of those local interactions, the whole thing arises. It's really only in human societies that we think that there's someone organizing things in a top-down way, and we draw these hierarchies with, let's say the president of the United States at the top and everything distributing down. But the fact is, you collapse that into a 2D net, and everything's just another node connected to other things. Maybe the person we think of as being at the top of a hierarchy has more connections to more nodes, but it's never completely global. And that's why authoritarian societies always collapse, because there's always a part where the revolution to overthrow things is happening. Or democracies can collapse because there's some part that's where the positive feedback loops are starting to predominate and get out of control. So everything is this bottom up thing. There's no global sense of it. And the final thing is my favorite. And it's kind of, like I said, where the magic happens. There's always a low level randomness in the system, a low level of unpredictability. So if you look at a food line from a distance, it looks like a straight line, and all the ants are following the food line. But if you bend down and look closely, you see that there's always a few ants not following the path. And so if you put your foot down in the middle of the food line and interrupt it, it's not the ants in the food line that rapidly find the new route around your foot. It's the ants that weren't part of the food line. So this is the low level unpredictability that allows for adaptation. If you have too much, then there's no self-organization whatsoever. But too little, then it's machine-like, and there's no chance to alter the behavior of the organization if the environment changes. Stuart Kauffman, who is one of the founders of Complexity and a mentor and a friend of mine, he uses the phrase that the result of this low-level randomness is that in each moment, there's this sort of cloud of adjacent possibles for what the next moment might be. It's not an infinite cloud of them, it's constrained. And that's because it's a low-level randomness. But that cloud contains all the possibilities for what the next moment might be. And depending on circumstances, one of those will be selected. Usually it's adaptive. These tend to be adaptive possibilities. And the next moment occurs. That way, that cloud vanishes and the next cloud of adjacent possibles emerges. So moment to moment, evolution of any living system, whether it's our city or your liver, I had to mention the liver somewhere, there's always this array of possibilities. But sometimes it's a mass extinction event that happens, and that's inevitable from the mathematics too. If you want me to explain more about that, I can go into it. But so what this means is the implications of being creatively adaptive and alive is inherent in this low-level randomness. But that means there's always the possibility in the next moment of death too. You can't be alive without death being a natural other side of the coin. There are complementarities I start to describe it. And so there's no such thing as a fountain of youth. There's no such thing as eternal life. When I see the longevity stuff that's popping up on the web, and it's like, nah, living things, if you're alive, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It can't work.
But it's a popular fantasy.
But it's a popular fantasy. Yeah.
Self-thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last thing I would add in is where this gets to the seamless stuff that I talked about, the fact that it extends. So you can say that, you know, bodies are made of, well, you know, a city is made of self-organizing humans. Humans are made of self-organizing cells. Those are made of self-organizing molecules. Those are atoms. Those are subatomic particles. And then you get down, it's not turtles all the way down in an infinite regress. It's, I like that phrase too. You get down to a smallest unit of size and the smallest unit of time. And space-time, it turns out, is not smooth the way Einstein described it. It's particulate, and it's an energy-rich field. And because it's an energy-rich field, thanks to Einstein, E equals mc squared, it's constantly erupting in small mass-containing entities, usually in matter-antimatter pairings. They arise and then self-annihilate and extinguish back into energy. But if they don't, and they survive, then they can interact with some other subatomic particle, or string, or whatever the smallest things are. And those become bigger subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, and the whole universe springs into existence. So everything is just, the entire universe is a complex system. And the notion of boundaries, you're here, and I'm here at the everyday scale. You're Greg, and I'm Neil, and we're separate. But at the cellular level, give me your hand.
With pleasure.
So at the cellular level, our bodies are 50% bacteria. And as I'm holding his hand here, I'm getting some of his dead skin cells that are coming off of my hand. And that's what the dust of the room is. But we also now know that we have our microbiome, the bacteria, without which we can't be a human being. All over our external surfaces and in the crevices inside our body. And whenever you touch something, you leave some of those behind. And we also know now that if you live in an apartment or a home with other humans, and let's say a dog and 2 cats, then in fact, the microbiome of all these beings becomes a single microbiome. And it's one single microbiome community that fills the apartment with islands that are cat islands, dog islands, human islands. And so at the cellular level, where's the boundary? We've already extended our boundary to include both of them. As you go down and further in scale, at the molecular level, just oxygen and carbon dioxide. We breathe out carbon dioxide, share that with the plants. The plants breathe out oxygen, share that with us. So at the molecular level, there's no separation between us and the entire biomass of the planet. It's one single organism. And at the atomic level, there's no atom in our bodies that we didn't eat, drink, or breathe from the planet. So you can say that we're individuals that conceive ourselves to be separate, walking around a rock we call Earth, or absolutely equivalently, this idea of complementarity, the idea that neither view is preferred, is sort of the big part of the whole second section of the book. Equally true, the Earth is made up of atoms that in 3.5 billion years have self-organized themselves into little creatures that think they're separate. But our boundary, in fact, is Earth. And at the quantum level, last year, the Nobel Prize for quantum entanglement, at this quantum level, there are no boundaries. Everything is seamlessly connected and intimately whole, containing the entire universe. And all these things we see as separate are actually just within that. And it's all a seamless whole. So this idea of separation and materiality is scale dependent. You pick one view, we're separate. You pick another view, there's no separation anymore. And that immediately starts to unpack into, in Buddhist metaphysics, emptiness of inherent existence, interdependence, karmic law, impermanence. That's the mass extinction event stuff. And suddenly there's no separation between the science and the spiritual stuff. And that's the book. plus a little more.
It's a lot, a little volume.
And if you want me to come back to any of that, we can come back to that in Q&A. Is someone watching the talk? You do that? Is that part of your
Sure.
sidekick thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
we're fine.
okay, good.
So where's the queer come in? You know?
Where isn't it? I've been thinking about this stuff for a really long time, and I've been talking to Donnie and Greg probably since the store started. That we should have a queer science series or whatever, and like
It has begun.
yeah,
You are in it.
in all our spare time. Yeah, let's do a bookstore series. It's kind of annoyed me and disappointed me in our community since I came out. And I came out very much in the context of a very important predecessor for you guys, A Different Light Bookstore, its original incarnation down on Hudson Street. And that's the bookstore where I bought books to help me come out in the first place. It's the bookstore where I went to go get, is it still in print, Betty Berzon's book? A book for, I knew my mother would need a book on having a gay child. And so on the way to the train to go home to come out to my parents in Hartford, I had to go to the bookstore to get the book. And it was called, Are You Still My Mother? And then better yet, in small print in parentheses beneath that, Are You Still My Father? We know who's going to read this book, right? But I was so anxious heading to the train. I knew this was the book, I had scoped it out, but I couldn't find it. And I needed the bookstore clerk to help me. And that turned out to be the guy who is my husband 36 years later. So that worked out well. And then, so very shortly, I mean, we moved in together basically after the first date, not the next day, but a couple of months later. And
Like good
lesbians, we were. And that was, and at the time, A Different Light was really the political activist center, I think it's fair to say, for what we then called the gay and lesbian community, soon we're to call the queer community. Most of the people who worked there were founding members of ACT UP and very active. And that was my sort of awakening politically and socially into what it means to be gay or to be queer. And there were all these books and there were all these magazines and there were all these news articles about queer artists and queer musicians and queer writers and queer dancers. And there were collections of essays about, there was one called Gay Spirit, which was about queer religion. There were anthologies of gay writers and gay poets, etc. And there was never anything about gay scientists. And it didn't really occur to me that that was missing until years went by. And I'm like, hey, wait a second, I'm not included in any of these anthologies. And if you look around, there's not a lot of presence of queer scientists, to some extent queer doctors because of the AIDS crisis, but even so, not a lot. And I thought, I was a nerdy kid. This would have been really helpful for me to know that there were scientists out there, astronomers or physicists or biologists or whatever, who I could model myself on. And I feel like that's been missing. And I look at the work I've done, and I don't think I could possibly have done, I wouldn't have done the kind of work I've done, and I wouldn't have had the nerve to do it if I hadn't grown up a closeted gay kid in the middle of the New England suburbs in the 1960s. All of that shaped what I'm capable of doing and why it wound up in a book.
Right. And you said to me the other day that shame is what keeps scientists in line.
I said that, that's good.
Yeah, I thought so. It stuck with me.
Yeah.
And it made a lot of sense with what you're saying. It's like shame is what keeps a lot of things in line.
Yeah.
And once that breaks apart, all sorts of possibilities open up, which for some is exciting and for others is terrifying.
And often both in sequence or
Yeah.
in some combination.
Right.
Yeah. So in order to survive being the kid I was, first I had to bury myself. And I woke up from a nap this afternoon with a real horrible. I was sort of, anticipating I'm going to come here and excavate the traumas of my youth. And I thought, and I had this image as I was waking up from a nap of that I had really worked hard to build a little box for myself to be in. And then I realized as I was waking up, we call that a coffin. So cheerful. But I wasn't prepared to come out. And for me, there were all sorts of social reasons, but in particular, I grew up as a child of Holocaust survivors. So in my head, I said to myself, I'm never going to get married. I'm never going to have any kids. I'm doing Hitler's job for him. And so that was right. And my parents, when I came out to my parents, eventually they were fine. And I told this to them, they were horrified that I've been walking around with, because they didn't put this on me. The planks were out there for me to build my box. I assembled them the way I wanted to. But there were two things that sort of set me on the path to this. And one of the things when I finished the book, only when I finished the book, I realized, all the learning of my entire life is in this. Stuff I learned when I was in 5th grade is in this. I was the kind of kid that what I learned in 5th grade was quantum physics and relativity, but okay. And a little geology. First, I knew that whatever the problem was that I didn't really understand that I had was something about what was below the neck. And there may be a few people in the room that remember the original Star Trek series. There was an episode of Brains in a Pan. And I just thought, wow, if I could evolve to be a brain in a pan, that would be really awesome. So that was a little wish I had. And, no body, just mind. Yeah. And science was a really good place to hide. I could go in and read Scientific American in 11th grade, when I was 11. Or we had a World Book Encyclopedia, and I would disappear into the bathroom and I read the entire encyclopedia, not in sequence, but I eventually realized I had randomly taken volumes off the shelf so much that I effectively read the entire, there wasn't a page I didn't recognize. So science also became a really neutral zone where it was safe. And I could be free to imagine whatever I wanted to imagine for myself in a way that was completely not dangerous. It wouldn't threaten anything. So, so that was the setup.
Yeah.
But then
the fantasy of science as neutral.
Right, yeah. And true.
Yeah.
And trustworthy.
And the whole issue of objectivity.
Right.
As if that is something that humans can attain.
Right. But I thought you could. And,
a lot of people still.
Right. Yeah, and I have my moments. But then when I got old enough to hit my crisis point, and fortunately, instead of jumping off the bridge, which I did, I got up on the railing, I came down from the railing, up on the railing, nice nerdy Jewish points, I couldn't make it. And then I ran home and called a therapist. And then went into analysis because I thought Freudian analysis would help me be straight. And I was in medical school at this point, so it was a mess. But through that process, what I realized is that I had built this box that needed to be dismantled. And when I looked around me, the whole society seemed like a box that needed to be dismantled. And when I met Mark and entered the social world of a different light, I started to be schooled politically in a way I had never been exposed to, that everything was questionable. When Mark and I talk a lot about when the marriage thing started happening, we were like, I thought our goal was to tear down the institution of marriage. We wanted to get rid of all this stuff. All right, that didn't go so well.
Although this may be the way we do it.
But this may be, exactly, this may be the way we do it, yeah.
Well,
Vertically
queers
from
can
the
marry, but
inside.
it no longer means anything.
No, exactly.
Nobody can have
But so it meant I had to, all these paradigms suddenly collapsed. And then I realized when I started doing my own research, there were all these paradigms that they were no more real or reinforceable than any of the other things. And there's a quote, I can't remember the entire quote, it's very long, but there was a woman scientist named Barbara McClintock. Are people familiar with her at all? So, in fact, I mean, she's kind of a queer icon, although it's ambiguous whether she was actually a lesbian or not.
You don't have to be a queer icon.
No, yeah. And one of the major, I think it was ACT UP, one of their major divisions pushing for, Dennis, do you remember? There was the Barbara McClintock.
Yes.
group.
I
And
didn't know anything about this. She knew nothing about it.
no, I know, and I'm sure she probably would have been a little freaked by it. But one of her major points was she said something like, when you're talking about biology, if you see something that doesn't fit, don't discard it as an aberration, an exception, a contaminant. So many good clues have been lost that way. And to me, that was the lesson of growing up a gay kid. It was like, I thought I was a contaminant. No, I was a clue that there's something for myself, that there was something far more than this. And so when I started noticing things that my mentors would see in my medical training, and I'd go, what's this? And they go, oh, you see that sometimes, it doesn't mean much. I tell my trainees now, anything like that, where a teacher says something like that to you, that's a career thing. And so, it is. So people are like, you know, so we mentioned in my biography, thank you, with the trimmed down thing in the book, stem cell plasticity. We started saying things, and my collaborators on this stuff in the early stages, they were all gay, men and women. That, oh, cells could do things we didn't think they could do. They could move and become things that no one expected them to do. The unfortunate thing was, because you can't control these things, is that when that became clear, it was that work that led to George Bush's address to the nation, suppressing embryonic stem cells, because we had showed that adult cells could do everything embryonic stem cells could do, unintended consequences. And then I got calls from Christian groups, anti-abortion groups, to come speak. And I said, the third time it happened, I was like, okay. I said, do you really want this New York Jewish, Buddhist, gay liver pathologist to come and speak to your group? And
I'll contaminate you.
I never got another. But publishing this stuff, we were actually, when we published the big paper on this stuff in Cell, which is the top tier journal for biology on the planet, we actually got one of the reviewers, who was a member of the National Academy of Science. I know it was him because he told me after, he was proud of this. The editor-in-chief of Cell took on this paper because it was so controversial and said to us in our acceptance letter, I will never forget this, as one of the reviewers said, quote, for each of the authors, this paper may be a reputation maker or a reputation breaker, close quote, and then offered us the chance to withdraw the paper rather than publish it. And shame. And we got on the phone with each other, my lesbian colleague from Yale, Diane Krause, and we were like, what? And we were like, no, of course we're going to publish this. But I think a lot of people thought we were crazy. And I think that part of the reason we were able to go ahead is because, look, we had come out and we survived
We're
that.
used to being called crazy. That's fine.
Yeah. And then the more recent thing with the interstitium thing, you know, calling it the 80th organ. And,
Do you want to say a little more for those who don't know?
so I was working with these guys who had a new endoscope that allowed them to look at the microscopy of living tissues in a living person. And they took a biopsy because they were seeing something that shouldn't exist. I looked at it and I said, that shouldn't exist. And they said, but it does. And I was like, you're right. And so what we discovered was that all the collagen in your body that form these connective tissue sheets that hold your body together, the stuff between the cells. And so that includes the epidermis, the dermis, the layer of your skin just below the epidermis, all the fascia covering all your muscles, all the connective tissue within all your visceral organs, the connective tissue around your brain and through your brain, the connective tissue around all your arteries and your veins and your nerves. It turns out it's one seamless whole. There's the theme again. And when you look at it in living tissue, under the microscope, it looks like just collagen, dense connective tissue, dense layers of collagen. And you see little cracks in them because collagen is really stiff. And when you're cutting tissue to make a microscope slide, it's very thin. So it cracks. And I've been taught, and I taught generations, that those are artifacts and we ignore those. It turns out we were wrong. The artifact is the collapse. There are these fluid-filled spaces supported by a collagen network. And what these guys saw with the endoscope was the fluid between these spaces. And so all this connective tissue in our body is a fluid-filled channel that spans every tissue and organ in the body. It's 25% of the fluid volume of your body. It's 4 times the volume of the cardiovascular system. And we've never seen it because we accepted the artifact as the real and missed what those cracks actually were. But when you take tissue out of the body, it dehydrates, so everything collapses. So that went viral 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 2018. But at the same time, because of a lot of the work that goes into this book, I've been associated with Deepak Chopra. So Forbes magazine wrote an article vilifying me, saying that none of my science could be trusted because look who I associate.
By association.
Yeah, and I was
How
like,
dare you think about spirituality? You're a scientist.
exactly. Fortunately for me, I really think growing up gay and coming to terms with that and dealing with it, particularly in as charged and it's still a deadly environment, but in the 80s and 90s, it was a particularly deadly environment. I don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
I just don't. What are you gonna do? Try and make me more afraid than I was for the first 27 years of my life. Right? So, and the result is I just follow my nose, the way queer people follow their noses. We always find the neighborhoods that are going to be gentrified.
They're
later.
always self-organizing.
Exactly, it's what we do. And it's always a bottom-up sort of thing. So you look at
Go ahead, Kendall. The bottoms organize everything.
Controlling bottoms. No, but then, never mind. So I don't think that there's nothing I've managed to do scientifically that isn't conditioned and supported and set in motion by the fact that I grew up gay and had to find a way to come to terms with it in a hostile environment and work my way through that. And I don't think that's uncommon. I think that I know plenty of gay physicians and scientists who have similar stories, but it's not the kind of story that we felt because scientists aren't sexy.
And a lot of us don't know what the fuck you're doing.
Yeah, there's that too. Yeah. But pardon me, some people in the room, dance. I don't get it. But a lot of people do. I just can't move that way. So I have no instinct for it. But when I see it, I'm like, okay. But there are volumes written on, every art form. Queer this, queer that, and religion, queer this, queer that.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about queer science. That's it.
Well, I think it's a fascinating thing just to bring in the idea of subjectivity. I didn't bring in that Roland Barthes quote I've told you about, but
Can you quickly,
I can just,
okay,
he wrote this book called Mythologies, which is a collection of very short essays about different things, different elements of French cultural life in the 50s. But in the introduction, he said, I can't do Roland justice. But basically, he resented the way that people looked at people like him, intellectuals, as having a hobby, whereas science was the real deal. Like, are scientists not human beings? Are they somehow gods removed from what they're studying? No, of course not. They are human beings.
right, but that, what made me see science as something I wanted to pursue, there was a bunch of stuff. I mean, that implicitly, I think from the beginning, my science interest started because I had this intimate sense of being connected to the world, which led to curiosity about the world, which led to reading about how things fit together. And suddenly I'm reading science. But I recognized it as a safe zone because exactly that. It's reliable, it's solid, there are truths. Yeah, it's not about me. It's about this world that can be built. And this is the second half of the book. Another thing I didn't expect the book to turn into is it's a real critique of modern materialism. And I've been headed that way. I just didn't realize how sharply I was going to go in that direction. But the fact is, no aspect of this culture we live in that says that the world is material and that the world is a machine and our bodies are machines. That came about, there's Newton, universe is machine, and the Industrial Revolution, machines started appearing like really good models for things. And then the collapse of medieval hierarchies, blah, blah, blah. So suddenly you had people, it was in the air around the turn of, the 19th, the 20th century, but it was really crystallized and formalized by a group of philosophers who you've never heard of, probably, named the Vienna Circle. And their view was to make science, to make philosophy the handmaiden of science, and that science would have the final word for all truths that one could say about reality. And what they meant by science was empirical science, a scientist studying an object, separation of subject and object, or mathematical formalisms. You could build a mathematics that would describe the entire universe completely and consistently, so we would understand everything. And that was their program. And that's the world we live in. Even if you interrupt people who have a spiritual bent on the street and you say, what's the best measure of reality? They still may just leap out with, oh, science and math. And not know why. It's because of these guys. They really crystallized it. The problem with that, and this is part 3 of the book, is that even as they were saying this, quantum physics already showed that there's no such thing as subject-object split in the quantum realm. So we know from quantum physics, is light made of waves or is it made of particles? Well, if you design an experiment without a conscious observer watching the experiment, then you get waves. If you have someone come in and look, then you get particles. So which is it? Well, it turns out to be both equally. It's dependent on how you choose to view the system. Is there consciousness involved directly or not? So quantum physics is suddenly saying there's no subject-object split, and that consciousness is the thing that comes before current existence. Consciousness is what the current moment arises from. It's the activity of consciousness that creates the world. What complexity does, I gave you that sort of hierarchy. Are you a thing, or are you a process made of cells? Are the cells things, or are they processes made of molecules? Well, if the whole universe is a complex system, then there is no thing anywhere. Everything is only process. So and if down at the quantum level, consciousness is what comes first, then there's no such thing as subject-object split, and there's no such thing as empirical science as the ultimate definition of what reality is. So they could fall back on mathematics. Well, we still have math. I mean, if we build these complete, beautiful systems of mathematics that can completely and consistently describe the universe. The problem for them was this guy named Kurt Gödel, who's really extraordinary. Like, I want someone to buy the rights to the book to make a docu-series about Gödel. Because there's like half a chapter on him.
And you wrote a lot more that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I wrote a whole biography of Gödel and I collapsed it down into a few paragraphs. First time writing authors, and what Gödel did and how he did it, I can't describe to you here. It's in the book. It's as condensed, I think, as humanly possible. But he created a mathematical proof that said that. Remember, I said mathematics should consistently and completely describe everything. Gödel proved that that's not possible. If you have a mathematical system that is complete, it will inevitably be inconsistent and contradict itself and fall apart. If it's completely consistent, and this was the key crazy thing, that there will always be things that are true that you can't prove to be true, but you can know to be true. And he proved it in using formal logic on their own terms, so they couldn't escape it. So the fact is, math can't do it either. And moreover, while the Vienna Circle and folks like our culture want to push metaphysics, the stuff that's beyond math and science, they want to push that off the map. Gödel said, no, the only way to get to the true nature of reality is to include intuition. And that includes intuitions through things like the practice of art or social interactions or meditation, insights of what the mind is like when the mind turns inward and looks at itself, which again isn't science, because if the mind is looking at itself, there's no subject-object separation. It's the self looking at the self. And yet things happen. And so that whole system completely collapses. And if that's the case and intuitions are admissible, then what are the possibilities for us? And if the whole universe actually is, from this perspective, one seamless whole, and the idea of separation is simply a matter of shifting perspective, then what possibilities are there for how humans can build a world around them that's inclusive of all living things, of the entire living conscious universe, and not be fighting to prove that it doesn't exist. So that's all I want to write about.
Yeah, well, I look forward to exploring that more with you and hearing other people who are more adept in speaking about science explore that with you. But I think it's a fascinating topic because we do have a very different relationship to what we come up with an experience of supreme so much doubt about ourselves, and can I trust my own mind? Do I really know myself? Are the feelings I have legitimate? Are they real? Are they all of that stuff?
And it opens up questions about, you know what, okay, I have these intuitions. Am I delusional or am I insightful? So these are issues, you know, we have to, my mental realities at different parts of my life, variously, you know, but that just means you have to develop criteria. That just means you have to be careful and you have to be considerate and you have to have compassion and look closely and carefully to me. So it doesn't mean that's off limits because it can't be trusted. It means, no, it can be trusted, but of course you have to do it carefully. The way you have to do science carefully and the way you have to do mathematics carefully.
And I think that's something that where people know. It's like once you do start trusting yourself, you're like, oh, all those things that were keeping me up at night are maybe just, or sometimes they just fade away and be like, what was I worried about?
Well, and some people, you know, often when I get to the divergent ants part of the talk, a lot of people will come up to me or say during Q&A, oh, that's like artists and poets, etc. And it is.
Scientists.
And scientists.
Scientists are
But it's
very
also-
like artists.
But it's,
yeah.
but it's also queer people, you know, we come in by necessity. I don't know if we're not gonna get into nature, nurture, blah, 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 blah. But the way our society is structured, if you're not gonna be able to conform to such rigid structures, then you start having to look elsewhere, and you become one of those ants that finds a new pathway, or you die, you break, you know, and those are what we should be doing in our society. And this is why I guess in our generation we're like, no, fuck marriage. No, it's about allowing for the exploration. But like you said, oh, look what we did. We gentrified. We went into the marriage neighborhood and turned it into a gayborhood. And now, you know, we are changing things that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, you know, I'd say gay people to some extent often function in cultures, societies, communities, or, you know, even in my workplace in the hospital as divergent ants that create new adjacent possibles for the culture. And that itself, you know, is extraordinary.
Amen. So we should open it up to questions now. We've been chatting for a while. Does anyone? Yes. Thanks.
Could you share your thoughts on the circumstances in which complex systems sentient, defined as some level of self-awareness, some level of desire for self-determination, perhaps apply that to emergent complex systems in AI?
I know I'm gonna have to be talking about this a lot for the next however many years I'm alive. So your first formal statement was something along the lines of how complex systems give rise to sentience. That's either, technically speaking, this is chapter 9. There are 3 general categories philosophically of how to look at how consciousness happens in the world. The first is the materialist perspective. And this is what I first came to. We've seen how emergent structures look like magic sometimes. How do ants create this whole thing? How do humans create this society? It just emerges. So you look at the brain and you think, oh, perfect. The brain is this incredibly complex thing with cells and electrical activity and molecules and hormones and all sorts of stuff going around. Maybe consciousness, sentience arises from that. The problem with that is what's known as the hard problem of consciousness, which David Chalmers famously coined that term, philosopher. And what that means is that there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of scientific papers where people have measured activities in the brain, either EEGs or anatomy or fMRI machines, and correlated what they saw with things within the conscious mind of the person they're examining. And so we know that if I see a red rose and pick it up, we know exactly how the light bouncing off the rose enters my eye, hits my retina, there's a chemical reaction, sends an electrical signal down my optic nerve to the back of my brain, and I see the color red. But that doesn't tell you how you experience the color red. It simply says how you receive that input. But it merely correlates with the experience of red. But it doesn't say anything about how the experience itself arises, or how the experience of smelling the perfume of a rose arises, or why do you feel pain when you prick your finger? This was a Nobel Prize, I think, 4 years ago. What's the pain thing there? Well, we now know the receptor and the electrical chemical signals that go, et cetera. But that doesn't tell you where the experience of the pain is felt, where it exists. And so neuroscientists always have to, it's mandatory when they publish their papers, they talk about neural correlates of consciousness. This thing in the brain correlates to that experience, but that doesn't mean that one causes the other. An example I use in the book is, gee, in summer, I see lots of people wearing sunglasses eating ice cream. I guess sunglasses make people eat ice cream. No, maybe it's, no, if you eat ice cream, you want to wear no, there's a separate cause behind both of them. So they correlate with each other very tightly, but it isn't causative. So how do you deal with that? The next approach, if that's not working, is panpsychism, which says that that consciousness pervades the universe. So it's starting to sound a little bit like the quantum physics thing. So maybe cells are conscious. And if you get cells assembling together the right way, they assemble into a larger, more complex consciousness. So complexity theory comes in again as a way to explain it. And that's where I went next. And I have a paper called, I don't remember what it was called, but where I explored how you can find sentience at the cellular level, at the molecular level, at the atomic level, at the quantum level. There's sentience all the way through. There are people who say that maybe they're quantum, and the crisis for materialism is such that this crazy stuff of panpsychism, which was verboten, about 10 years ago became the dominant discourse in consciousness studies because cognitive neuroscience wasn't doing it. There are people who say that maybe there are quantum particles that are conveyors of consciousness. There are people who say that space-time itself is what gives rise to consciousness. But they all still have the same problem as the heart problem. Where does the experience of it come from? You're just pushing it down to smaller levels of scale. The third possibility is what Max Planck and Heisenberg, the founders of quantum physics, but also many different contemplative and shamanic traditions where you have practices of examining the mind, is that mind comes first. Mind is the source out of which material reality arises. And that's the final part of the book. So coming back to complexity explaining where sentience arises, awareness is the nature of existence. And the contents of material reality are the contents of this universal mind, the way your dreams are the contents of your mind when you're sleeping, or the experiences of that rose are the contents of your mind when you're having the experience. But sentience doesn't happen from something, it's the underlying something. So now when you get to AI, well, first off, notice we're not calling it artificial consciousness, we're calling it artificial intelligence. It's just high-level calculations, and depending on what you put in, garbage out. If you want to have beautiful English literature and only select literature written by straight white dudes, then you're going to be missing whole ranges of the possibilities of language because that's all you put in. And if you decide to be maximally inclusive of all of English literature of all time, well, what about all the other literatures of all of humans? So artificial intelligence, it's just high-level computation and is always going to be limited by what we've put into it. So I don't think, and it doesn't fulfill the criteria of a complex system. It's not going to be self-generating and adaptive in that way. Is it possible to have an artificial consciousness? Well, what's the relationship of our brain to our minds? If our brain isn't making the mind, then the other way to look at it is the mind is like a radio that's sensing infinite radio waves and transducing it is the engineering term into sound you can hear. You don't expect to open up your radio and see the Beatles. You could also, using our computers, instead of getting sound, you can have a light show if you play a song. You don't have to get sound. You just transduce it to light. Our brains are the transducers that take the infinite signal of that underlying consciousness and transduce it into our own minds that think we're separate and a self, and that have thoughts that we think are specific to us. Biology can build such a transducer. Can we do that? Probably. But I think then what you'd have to be getting, what that's going to require, and I have an asterisk in the book to point at this, is that you have to have some sort of quantum level thing. because there's got to be that randomness in the system, but it's constrained randomness you have to have. So, so I think that's the possible route. But I think the whole AI thing, this isn't about consciousness. It's not about sentience. It's about elaborate programming. And this is the thing about Gödel's proof. It couldn't, a computer, many people have talked about the nature of his proof. And if you're nerds and know about Alan Turing, who's the founder of computer science, the universal Turing machine is who was gay. Yeah, there's a gay scientist, and you know, okay.
Chemically castrated
Right.
by the state.
Right. But the universal Turing machine, which led to our concepts of computer science, was an elaboration on Gödel's theory. It was a generalization of Gödel's theory. So all of that is tied together. And blah, blah, blah. Was that an okay answer? All right. Thank you. In Zen practice, we finish things like this with a bang of the stick. And one person says, thank you for your answer. And then the other person says, may your life go.
Where's your stick? Any other questions?
I can try for a short answer. No, we're fine. All right, thank you very much.
We'll pick the chairs up. If you would like to purchase Neil's book, we have copies at the register. If you've already got copies and you'd like them signed, we would love it if you sort of lined up on that side of the room. Neil will use the table at the front to meet and sign.
And this is my cue to say something. I'm in a very delicate state these days because I have a little bit, what did I say before? A jittery squirrel?
Oh, I just remember the extinction event.
Oh, okay, well, so I had a couple of mass extinction events in my brain about 2 months ago, and I had 2 tiny little strokes. And so you see, I'm actually quite fine. I'm never likely to have another one. I have no residua, but I have tremendous fatigue. So I'm on a medical leave from work, for what some people would call a sabbatical. But I'm really, this is my second time we had a launch party, and that was tenuous. Sensory input is hard for me. So it's easy for me to be here and you there. But if you come and talk to me, like to sign the book, you can't talk to me while I'm signing the book because I can't do 2 things at once. And if there are too many people sort of coming at me, jittery squirrel, I'm a little, so that's all, just be careful near me. And otherwise I'm fine, and don't worry about me.
And stay tuned for more about queer science events coming up.
Yeah.
If you're going online.